Hello, my name is Matt Staley. I'm launching a series of history videos called Personal History, based on the experiences of people who lived through different times and events and recorded what they witnessed. Some of these are known historical events, while others are more personal or about daily life at the time. I've long been a student of history, and while in college at Florida State University, had a professor share the idea that history tends to have a living memory of a couple of generations, meaning that as someone born in the 1970s, I have direct knowledge gained by talking with people who lived through roughly the First World War era, such as my great-grandparents. As opposed to large-scale world history, this type is more personal and is based on the day-to-day life experiences of those who lived in those times. Fortunately, as technology progressed in the 1970s and 80s, it became easier for the average person to get actual recordings of people that could preserve these memories and stories. Like any oral history, it is based on the perception of those relaying it. Their biases, gaps in memory, and blending of memories over time are all at play in their recounting. These stories are presented as simply that, stories from times long past by those who experienced them. The first few of these stories are based on the recollections and recordings of family members, such as my grandparents, a great-uncle, etc. This initial set of stories are from my maternal grandfather, Ben Ramsier. He was born in New Martinsville, West Virginia in 1921. Many of the stories from his youth take place in and around New Martinsville, which is a small town on the Ohio River. Even today, it only has about 5,000 inhabitants. His father was a blacksmith, and they were a very poor family. In later years, Ben recounted they moved often, and today would probably be called drifters. Long known as a great storyteller, he made some recordings of some of these stories in the 1980s, and also dictated many more that my late mother transcribed. The first of these stories center around a rather memorable character named Harold that he and his father knew when Ben was still a young boy in New Martinsville. But I'll let him take the story from here.
And we're rolling.
My name is Benny Joseph Ramsier. I was born April the 2nd, 1921 in New Martinsville, West Virginia. And my father and mother were movers. I went to gone to 7 different schools. One of them I went 3 times because they moved in, but they didn't leave the community that the school was in. My father took me when I was 9 years old into his blacksmith shop, and he was a World War I veteran blacksmith. That was when they pulled the artillery and the heavy equipment with horses, and he would keep the shoes on them. And I caught on pretty fast. He taught me to be a welder. And but getting back to a little bit about my father was of Swiss descent. All of his side of the family came from Switzerland. But on my mother's side, her mother was a Cherokee Indian, as far as I can tell, because I never got interested in it like I should have when I could find what tribe. She was a brilliant woman. She could play a violin. She was a midwife, and she knew lots of people. Her husband, my grandfather, was a German, and he was he could make anything, do anything, and work at anything. And I got a lot of that from him. When I got old enough to get a job, I went to work on the farm for a man, which I made my home with, for 3 years. Wonderful people, and they just treated me like their son. And how I come to do that was my father and mother separated when I was in the 7th grade, and I never finished the 8th grade. And that ended my school for the time being. But then after the superintendent of the school that I attended, the superintendent came to my dad and talked to him for quite a while, that I should be in school, but I said I was very good, and by all means to get me in school. So he sent me to Sterling, Ohio, with his brother, and there I worked after being out of school for about 3 years. Then I worked for just my board. And I told them that I'd finished the 8th grade, which was not true, but they let me start as a freshman. And I worked till I was halfway through my junior year, and I got a job in a packaging corporation plant. It was the largest consolidated paper mill in the world.
Well, here it is, Matthew, April the 25th, 1985. Soon will be half gone. Back, Matthew, to when I was just a little boy myself many years ago. And it reminded me of the neighbor that I had, which was just exactly opposite from everything you are. He was a very naughty boy, so to speak. As a matter of fact, the people in the community, they referred to him as just being right down ornery. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about Harold. Harold was a nice-looking boy, red hair, freckles, had a good dad and mom, came from a nice home, had every opportunity in the world that any boy most boys would like to have, but for some reason, he just was very unruly. I remember quite well that my dad and my brother John and I, we went to town one time, and my dad had an aunt there. He would be my great aunt, your great great aunt. And Aunt Mary was a lovely person, but she was in her late 80s. Her health was failing, and it was quite evident that she wasn't going to be around too long. So on her way down to Aunt Mary's house, we met Harold. Well, Harold was a neighbor to Aunt Mary, so Dad knew quite well that he would know of her condition. So we stopped and began to talk to Harold. He came over the car, and he told Dad, he said, I hate to tell you this, Joe, but he says it's bad news, but poor old Aunt Mary passed away this morning about 6 o'clock. And of course, we were very sad because we loved the dear old lady. And so Harold proceeded to take his handkerchief out and cry, wipe the tears, and go on up the street. So Dad, John, and I, we went down to the house, and expecting to find a house full of people, as it was a custom in those days after a death in the family. And I remember so well tiptoeing in with Dad, and who did we meet but Aunt Mary? And she just smiled and laughed about the whole matter and says, "Oh, that is Harold." And she actually was feeling better than she had for a long time. And I remember also the incidents where he was a wonderful swimmer. His home was right on the riverfront, the high river. And so in those days, Matthew, before television and radio, a showboat was one of the most exciting things that happened to a little town of about 4,000 population where we lived. And each summer, 2 or 3 times, the showboats would come. And we could hear them down the river a long ways before they ever came in sight. In those days, they played music. We call it a calliope. And we'd hear the songs in a distance of Let Me Call You Sweetheart and Sweet Adeline and all the old ones. And then the showboat would come in sight. Well, Harold made it a practice, and quite often when the showboat got up, even with the little village, he would swim out to it. And he would crawl up on the deck, and then he had a speech that he would make to all the people about you're about to witness the most amazing feat of the day and a most death-defying act known to man. And it was very dangerous what he would do, because then he would run and the length of the boat and dive up over the boat wheel and into the foam, and then he could swim underwater so well, and all the passengers and all the ladies on that boat, they would scream because they would be sure that that was the end of him. He was going to be cut to pieces down there under the wheel or drowned. And frankly, it always amazed most people that that he didn't drown. Then another incident I remember, Dad had a blacksmith shop. This would be your great-great-grandfather. And so he chewed mail pouch chewing tobacco. And it was, Harold had just made it a practice of about every Saturday morning, he would come up to Dad's blacksmith shop and beg tobacco. And of course, it didn't make any difference whether Dad gave him permission or not. He'd go back where Dad had his coat hanging on the door, and he would proceed to help himself to Dad's tobacco. Well, now Harold's father just didn't like this, and he didn't approve of it at all. So this particular Saturday morning, about 8:30, his father came in, and he told Dad, he said, "Now don't get any of your tobacco today because I'm going to break that kid from chewing tobacco." So I went back and he got Dad's package of tobacco out of his coat, and he put in about a tablespoonful of cayenne pepper. Now, Matthew, if you've ever tasted any cayenne pepper, just a tiny spot on your tongue just sets your mouth on fire. It burns terrible. So he put the tobacco sack back in Dad's coat and went and sat down on the bench in the blacksmith shop with the rest of the fellows, waiting for Harold to come in. And about 9:30, 10 o'clock, here came Harold. He come in. He asked Dad for a chew of his tobacco, but he always called it a cut of tobacco. So this pleased his dad. He thought it was working out just fine. So Harold went back and he stuffed his mouth full of this doctored up tobacco. He came out, he sat down on the bench beside the rest of the men, and he proceeded, as the rest of them, to spit a circle out in the dirt dust floor of the blacksmith shop. Well, he sat there and he chewed this for about 10 minutes, and his mouth had to have been like a coal of fire. His lips were red. Finally, he got up and went back to Dad, and he said, "Joe, if you don't mind, I'll have another little cut of your mail pouch. Then I'm going to take a stroll up to the pool hall to see what the boys are doing." So he went back and he stuffed his mouth full of the tobacco, come out and walked out. Well, he knew quite well what had happened. He knew that his dad had no doubt pulled this on him, but he would not give in. He would not even show any signs of the pain and the misery that he must be in. But nevertheless, after he went out, his dad sat there with his head down and the palm of his hand pressed together for a few seconds, and he finally raised up and looked at all the rest of the men. He said, "Now, fellas, what would you do if you had an ornery little devil like that?" Well, it was only a few days after that he come into Dad's blacksmith shop one forenoon, and he asked Dad, "What time do you close up of an evening?" So Dad told him, he said, "Well, I usually close up at 5, and I get home by 5:30. Well, he wanted to make a deal with Dad that he wouldn't get home that night until at least 6 o'clock. But Dad told him, "No, there's no extra work, and I have nothing coming in, and I'm going to be home tonight my regular time." But he insisted that tonight you're not going to make it. Well, Dad really didn't give that much thought, and he continued. The kid left, and Dad continued to work. And that evening, about 4:45, he slipped around to the back of Dad's shop, and he locked the door from the outside. Then he ran around to the front of the shop and closed the doors and trapped Dad in there, locked it from the outside. And he didn't unlock those doors, although Dad begged him and tried every way to convince him to do that. He didn't unlock and open those doors and let Dad out there till about 5 minutes till 6. And of course, he was absolutely right. Dad didn't get home. He was quite late that night. But one of the funniest things that he ever done, and it could have been very dangerous, it could have cost the life of a young lady. This circus came to town. Well, it was the practice of the circus to have something very outstanding, very exciting, to get the people all worked up and stirred up and in the mood for a circus. So the outstanding feature of that particular circus was that they had buried this woman. About 9 o'clock in the morning, they had buried her, put her in a 6-foot grave, put her in a coffin, and actually buried her. And about 2 in the afternoon, they had a large group of people around, and they was telling that this woman was buried alive, and they didn't know what the consequences would be, but they had no intentions of digging her up until after the sun set that evening. Well, Harold was right down in the front row, making a nuisance out of himself as usual, and he got into a hassle with the circus crier that you would dig the lady up. That he knew you'd dig her up, and you wasn't going to fool him. You might fool the rest of these people, but you would not fool him. Well, finally, he'd made such a nuisance out of himself that he did get the attention of the master of ceremonies, and he proceeded to ask him. He said, "Now tell the people, now down here in front's a young man that does not believe it. He's a real skeptic. He's sure that we're not going to leave this young lady buried until the sun sets, the sun goes down." And finally, he proceeded to ask the young man, "Why do you think that I'm not going to dig the young lady up until the sun sets?" And Harold proceeded to tell him, "Because the breathing line that you secretly put down over the riverbank into those tall weeds about an hour ago, I stuck a corn cob in it. And believe me, Matthew, they dug her up immediately, and they didn't dig her up a bit too soon." Then another time, he was a big tease. He teased, he worried people any way that he could stir people up. That was exciting for him. So there was a lady that lived beside him by the name of Mrs. Cox, and she knew that Harold was headed for real trouble sooner or later, and she tried every way in the world to be a pal to him and straighten him up, get him interested in school, and just do different. So one afternoon he came down over to her place, and he told her that he agreed with her that he had just worried his parents, he'd been in trouble. And he said that, "Mrs. Cox," he says, "you know, the world would just be better off without me." And of course, she didn't agree to that. She tried to encourage him and tell him no, that was not the case. And well, he said he appreciated it very much, and he appreciated her love, but he said, "I've given this a lot of thought. I've been thinking about this for a long time." And he says, "I've decided, Mrs. Cox, to end it all." And he said, I've just decided that there's no other way out. It'd be better for the whole community and everyone concerned if I would just take my own life." And he said, "I've just decided to swim out there in the river and drown myself." Well, this Mrs. Cox, she dearly loved the boy, and she just begged him and done everything. And he just went out and jumped in the river and swam. He was a wonderful swimmer, so he swam out in the river about 30 feet, waved to her goodbye, and told her that thanked her for everything, and tell Mom that Mom will understand if she tells him, and he went down. Well, Mrs. Cox run down to his mother's house screaming, and his mother couldn't hardly get her settled down enough to understand what she was trying to tell her. And finally, when she did understand, his mother just laughed at it. She says, "Why, Mrs. Cox, that ornery little rascal will be back in time for supper tonight." Sure enough, that night about 5:30, here come that tall, red-headed, freckled kid down the street whistling.